is Cindy Frederick, and I'm the Senior Associate Vice President for Engagement here at the University of Virginia. I am pleased to welcome so many UVA alumni, friends, and family members from around the world for today's special webinar, The Attack on Ukraine and Why It Matters. We have over 1,500 registrations from around the world, and the interest was so high as we had an average of 4 registrations coming in every minute when we first announced this session. This webinar is a collaboration between the UVA Office of Engagement and the Office of Global Affairs. Before we begin, I want to note that this event is being recorded. If you do have questions, and we had a lot of ones submitted over 100, but we still want some online questions as well, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Ambassador Mull will try and answer as many questions as possible after his main talk. At this time, I'm honored to invite Stephen Mull to join me on screen. Welcome, Steve. I'm delighted that you are here and just very thankful that you are spending time with us. I just want to tell our audience a little bit about your background before we begin. And Ambassador Mull, you are the Vice Provost for Global Affairs at the University of Virginia. In your role here, you're responsible for developing a strategic vision, designing outreach, and overseeing international programs here at UVA. Over your distinguished career, you've held a variety of national security roles, including acting undersecretary for the political affairs at the U.S. Department of State. You are a U.S. ambassador to Poland from 2012 to 2015, and ambassador to the Republic of Lithuania from 2003 to 2006. During your tenure as the lead coordinator for the Iran nuclear implementation, you led interagency efforts and diplomacy to implement the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In 1982, you joined the Foreign Service and currently hold the rank of Career Ambassador, the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Services. Steve, thanks again for being with us here today. I know that there are so many demands on your time at this point in history, and I'm so grateful that you are here sharing your insights with our UVA alumni, friends, and families community. Steve, I will turn the program over to you, and I'll look forward to our Q&A session in just a bit. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Cindy, for that very nice introduction, and good afternoon to everybody in our quite large audience this afternoon. I have to say that the concern and interest of the broader UVA community in such a vital issue as what's going on in Ukraine these days is just another reminder of how lucky I am to be part of the broader UVA community for the past 3 years. And what a pleasure it is to be able to spend this time with you in the broader UVA family, even on such an unfortunate and distressing issue. It's been exactly a week now, just over a week, that Russia invaded Ukraine in an unprovoked manner. Despite the invasion being so accurately forecast for weeks ahead of time by US intelligence, what we're seeing on our TV screens and social media accounts every day is no less horrifying. I think we have to be clear about what's going on. Of course, this is an assault on Ukraine, but it's more than that, which is why all of us should be concerned. It's an assault on democracy and democratic values, on the right of free people to choose their own leadership and choose the countries that they want to associate with. And even bigger than that, it's an assault on the European security system and order that's been in place since the end of World War II, that's largely kept the peace for 75 years, as it has built a steadily expanding zone of democracy and unprecedented levels of prosperity across the transatlantic community. I think it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the history of a brief history of Ukraine and how we got to the situation we're in today. Interestingly, Ukraine has been on the fault line of European security conflict for centuries, going back hundreds, even more than 1,000 years back. That said, it's never existed as an independent country until 1991, when the Soviet Union was beginning to collapse. The leadership of Ukraine held a referendum to determine whether or not Ukraine should strike out on its own as an independent state. And in that referendum in December of 1991, a whopping 92% of the entire population, Russian speaking and Ukrainian speaking alike, voted that Ukraine should become an independent state. And it's had that status fully established in the United Nations, has its own diplomatic relations, including recognized by Russia up until recently for the past 30 years. The road to Ukrainian independence and on Ukraine's road of independence has not been a particularly easy one. It's gone through a series of presidents, a couple of them early on, Presidents Kravchuk and Kuchma, who between the two of them governed Ukraine from 1991 until 2005, were largely sympathetic to Russian interests, but began to get more and more interested in developing a richer relationship with Europe and the United States. They faced governing challenges over the years. About 30% of the Ukrainian population is Russian speaking primarily. The rest speak Ukrainian, although most Ukrainian speakers also do speak Russian as well. And the Russian speakers are concentrated in the East, and the primary Ukrainian speakers are concentrated in the West. Now, since 1991, Ukraine has struggled mightily with problems of corruption, not very well established free market economy, severe disparity in wealth, not a particularly well-developed civil society, and all of the other hallmarks of what a free market democracy should look like. But over these past 30 years, it's been making steady progress with a lot of help from Europe and the United States to address these problems. One of the interesting footnotes of Ukraine's development as an independent state was that as the Soviet Union was falling apart, there were a number of Soviet nuclear weapons that were stationed on Ukraine's territory. And this was something of great concern to the United States and our European allies, because we didn't want to see nuclear weapons spread out all over a range of countries where they could easily be sold or transferred to terrorist groups. So we set as an early priority removing nuclear weapons from all of these states that were formerly in the Soviet Union and returning them to Russia. And in 1994, President Clinton, Prime Minister Major of Great Britain, President Yeltsin from Russia, and President Kravchuk met in Budapest in 1994 to sign something known as the Budapest Memorandum. And in that memorandum, Ukraine agreed to surrender all of the nuclear weapons on its territory back to the Russian military in exchange for all three of those states recognizing Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation and committing themselves to respect Ukraine's borders at the time. That's a very important commitment today because, of course, Russia has essentially torn up that commitment in violating Ukraine's sovereignty. For the next 10 years after that, social attitudes in Ukraine became gradually more pro-Western. And when it came time to elect a new president from President Kuchma in 2004, there were two main candidates, Viktor Yushchenko, who advocated accelerating Ukraine's integration with the West, possibly including joining NATO and joining the European Union. And his opponent was Viktor Yanukovych, who favored developing a more constructive relationship with Russia. In that election campaign, Yanukovych was declared the winner, but there were credible allegations of massive fraud. And in the end, early in 2005, the Ukrainian Supreme Court declared the results of the election null and void because of massive corruption. and ordered new elections. Those elections were held with international observers, and Viktor Yushchenko won that election and proceeded to accelerate Ukraine's association with the West. Interestingly, while he was preparing to be a candidate for that election, you may remember that Mr. Yushchenko was almost assassinated through a very severe poison attack, widely suspected to be organized by the Russian security services. In any case, Yushchenko, his health returned, he won the election, he took power and began working to move Ukraine more to the West. And he was partially successful because in 2008, he convinced the Bush administration to be strongly supportive of declaring that Ukraine would one day be in NATO. This was deeply and controversially debated within the Bush administration at the time. I remember those discussions very well. Some people opposed it because they believed it would be very provocative to Russia and destabilizing and bring an attack on Ukraine. Others said that Ukraine was at risk from Russian aggression and that we should bring it in within NATO before it was actually attacked. There was also a debate about Georgia, and in the end, the Bush administration committed to declaring that both Ukraine and Georgia would one day be members of NATO. There was major opposition to this idea within our European allies, particularly France and Germany, who very much opposed making that kind of commitment to Georgia and Ukraine because they believed it would provoke conflict. And sure enough, a few months after this declaration by the Bush administration, the Russians attacked Georgia and basically seized control of two breakaway provinces, which certainly has its echoes today in what's going on in Ukraine. Although that conflict ended within less than a month and the Russians withdrew, although they still to this day have troops in the two breakaway provinces. In 2010, Yushchenko was accused of incompetence and not being particularly effective as president. And the more Russian-aligned candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, ran again for president. And this time he won and became president in 2010. And rather than irritate Russia by continuing to advocate for joining NATO, the Yanukovych government was certainly aware of increasing sentiment, political support within Ukraine for closer relations with the West. So he decided to accelerate efforts to sign what's called an association agreement with the European Union, which would have put Ukraine on a path to membership in the European Union. These negotiations were very detailed, took a long time to run, but by the fall of 2013, they were very close to being signed. And just before Yanukovych was going to sign this agreement with the European Union, Putin of Russia put enormous pressure on him to not do it and instead tried to entice Yanukovych into a enhanced economic relationship with Russia. Yanukovych gave in to Putin's demands, indicated that Ukraine would not sign this association agreement, and that prompted a major uprising at the end of 2013 going into 2014, which resulted in Yanukovych fleeing from Ukraine to safety in Russia. That today in Ukraine is known as the Revolution of Dignity. Immediately following Yanukovych's departure from power, the Russians decided to retaliate by invading Ukraine, although they weren't wearing Russian army uniforms. They were called Little Green Men. There were Russian special forces, not formally identified to be part of Russia. And they infiltrated the two provinces that are in the news today, Donetsk and Luhansk, and seized control and empowered Russian-speaking separatists in those regions, in those provinces, provided them with arms. They shot down, of course, the Malaysian airliner back in 2014, as this killing a couple of hundred people, all coming from fighting in these two breakaway regions. The Russians also unilaterally seized the Crimean Peninsula, which the Soviet Union had gifted to Ukraine in the 1950s, and they seized it back and took control. As you might imagine, this sent quite a chill through Ukraine, who realized that, well, if we weren't in NATO, if we had been in NATO, none of this would have happened. We would have had Europe and the United States defending us. So even though Putin was trying to avoid this, in fact, those actions increased Ukrainian demands and to join NATO to such an extent that by 2019, joining NATO became enshrined in Ukraine's constitution as a key national security interest for Ukraine, which irritated Putin and the Russian government even more. All of that said, there's no one who follows international relations who believes that Ukraine is going to join NATO anytime soon, even before this invasion happened last week. In fact, most observers believe that it would be at least 10 years, if not longer, before the NATO alliance would be unanimously ready to invite Ukraine to become a member. The question remained very controversial within Europe. So if that's the case, you may ask, why is Putin invading Ukraine now? Well, I think it's a combination of a number of factors. First of all, there was no one spark that started the war. There was no moment like at the beginning of World War I when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Rather, I think it's a combination of a number of geopolitical factors that played very much in Putin's thinking. One, I think he came to the conclusion with the US exit from Afghanistan, which of course did not go as neatly as the Biden administration wanted it to, and reports of overwhelming disillusion among Americans within the United States political scene to not want to be involved in overseas conflicts after 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. He also realized that, contrary to earlier reports, European dependence on Russian energy supplies was getting much greater. Europe gets about 40% of its natural gas supplies for Russia. And so Putin, I think, calculated that he had a great deal of leverage over European views. He also, of course, he contributed to this. There's a great deal of political polarization in Western democracies, as the Russians promoted in the 2016 presidential election, promoted in Brexit, promoted in French political campaigns, promoted in German political campaigns. And so he believed that that kind of polarization would somewhat paralyze the West from making any kind of response. He also was very aware of tensions that existed in the transatlantic alliance over the past 4 years. At one point, President Trump had threatened pulling the United States out of NATO, refused to recommit the United States to the Article 5 guarantee in NATO to defend other members of NATO. And so I think he was believing that there would be a lack of Western unity in response to any move against Ukraine. On top of that, the world economy is in extreme state of volatility, some cases depression because of the impact of COVID and other reasons. There's a new government taking power in Germany, the Social Democrats, who for many years generally had a friendlier approach and a more accommodationist approach to Moscow. And then on the Russian side of the ledger, over the past year, Russia has succeeded in more firmly co-opting the Belarusian government of Alexander Lukashenko under the Russian umbrella. Russia strengthened its position in Central Asia with Kazakhstan. And the Russian military is also at its strongest point in at least 30 years, with a lot of new military skills, military technology that they developed fighting in the civil war in Syria, particularly in pursuing urban combat. So Putin, I believe, has found himself to be a lot more confident that this was the right time to strike. And adding to that, the Ukrainian military, the conflict in separate provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk, which have been going on for 8 years, resulting in thousands of people being killed. The Ukrainian military, in fact, was making very slow but very steady progress in recapturing that territory. So that was a further reason to impel Putin to act. Now, of course, none of these reasons were cited in Putin's rationale for going to war in his public comments in the past week. Instead, he manufactured a rationale. As a former diplomat, I probably shouldn't say this, but he manufactured a rationale that is a sort of a pack of lies. He alleged that Ukraine is committing genocide, that Ukraine is governed by Nazis, even though the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, is Jewish, that Ukraine is developing nuclear weapons, that Ukraine is on the brink of joining NATO, and NATO wants to use Ukraine as a platform to attack Russia. None of this is true. And of course, he went on to say that Russia does not believe that Ukraine is a legitimate, independent, sovereign state, that it is so fully integrated. Ukrainians and Russians are integrated as one people, and Ukrainians don't have the right to exist as a separate state, even though 92% of them voted to be that. And that kind of strong national identity has only gotten stronger in Ukraine over the years. By acting, it seems pretty clear that Putin is looking to decapitate the Ukrainian government and replace it with a more pliable government that will stop Ukraine's westward drift and more firmly anchor it into the Russian sphere of influence. Now, why should we care? It's a fair question. Ukraine is not in NATO. It's far away. Americans are tired of the last 20 years of war in which we've paid such a heavy price as a society in terms of so many brave lives lost and the cost of running these wars. I think there are a number of reasons why the United States should care about this. First of all, the United States has a NATO alliance commitment to states like Poland, which has a 332-mile border, Hungary, the Baltic states, 332-mile border with Ukraine, but Hungary, the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Romania, which, if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, all of these allies of the United States will be on the front lines of a possibly heavily militarized border with Russia and Russian-friendly states. There's a part of European geography called the Suwałki Gap. That's a 60-mile border between Poland and Lithuania that stretches from Belarus in the east to Russian Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea on the west. If that 60-mile gap were closed, the three Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia would suddenly be completely surrounded by Russia and Belarus, which would put them in a very precarious security position, raising risks since the United States is obligated to protect them. Aside from military calculations, we already see this happening now. This is one of the world's worst humanitarian crises in many years. Already, more than 1 million Ukrainians have left Ukraine. The United Nations estimated yesterday that by the time this is over, 10 million Ukrainians could be fleeing from Ukraine to seek refuge elsewhere in the world. Some of you may remember that during the last wave of refugees, which was much smaller than 10 million people, with refugees from the Middle East coming to Europe in 2015, that contributed to major political crises domestically in Europe that ended up causing a lot of the polarization that we're still seeing today. There's also, we'll talk about this in a little bit, one of the major parts of the United States and the West's response to the invasion has been the heavy application of sanctions. There's likely to be a major spillover effect resulting in major price hikes in the cost of fuel cost of gasoline at the pump. And there's also going to be a likely strong impact on the world's food security, as Ukraine is a major exporter of grain, of which many nations in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world are heavily dependent. So if this war continues for much longer, we're very soon going to see outbreaks of hunger and famine in other parts of the world that will also demand a response. There's also a major, this represents, as I mentioned at the beginning, a major challenge to the European security order, which over the past 75 years has featured a steady expansion of free market democracies and accompanying prosperity to an unprecedented level in the transatlantic community. Now, when nations like Russia overturn democratic nations and redraw the map of Europe, that's enormously destabilizing, and it has implication for the security of other smaller countries and other regions that are right now the focal point of big power competition, from a situation in the Balkans, which has largely held the peace for the past 20 years. A Russian victory in Ukraine will likely inspire Serbia and Bosnia Serbs to become more aggressive in pursuing their own dominance in the Balkan region. The implications for what lessons China will take as it considers whether or not to seize Taiwan. But there's so many other regions around the world: Western Sahara, Kashmir, the West Bank, Georgia, Moldova, all of which, if Russia succeeds in using this tactic, other aggressors will draw lessons from that and risk other outbreaks of conflicts like this around the world. There's also a risk of nuclear contamination. All of you saw yesterday, I hope, that Russian forces fired on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear reactor, the largest nuclear reactor in Europe. Fortunately, there appears to be no dispersal of radioactive material, but there are 15 nuclear reactors now operating in Ukraine. Anytime you have a war zone and an insurgency that could very well follow from this, the security of those reactors becomes a risk, not only for the people who live there, but from the broader world, as we certainly learned during the Chernobyl crisis back in 1986. There's also a different nuclear risk, and that's of nuclear weapons proliferation. We talked about the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons of which it had possession in exchange for guarantees on its border. I can tell you that there are a lot of voices in Ukraine saying, "Oh, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have given up those nuclear weapons. We'd be a lot safer today if we were." There were similar voices when the Gaddafi regime was overthrown in Libya. Gaddafi had given up his nuclear weapon program in the early part of this century. That too prompted people like in North Korea and elsewhere in teaching them a lesson that maybe it's not so good to give up nuclear weapons capability. And of course, it has implications for our current efforts with Iran to contain its nuclear program. There's also an escalation risk to all of this. As we pile on the sanctions onto Russia, if Putin is feeling cornered, it will prompt him to retaliate in some way. We've already seen him publicly put his nuclear forces on high alert. That could be followed by cyber attacks on US and European infrastructure that could exact real damage on our economy, to say nothing of the rising prices in gas that would likely happen by any effort to curtail the sale of Russian energy. And finally, why we should care, I don't mean to sound naive, it's a moral question, frankly. Countries should not be allowed to march into their neighbors and decapitate their governments, governments that in fact pose no threat at all to the invading power. If we're moving into a world where countries can invade others at will, it's not going to be very safe for any of us. Now, the Western response has been rather unprecedented, I think, much to Mr. Putin's surprise. You may remember going back into the winter, the United States began to, in an unprecedented way, release declassified intelligence indicating the substantial Russian military buildup on the border of Ukraine, and also began publicizing other intelligence reports that we were able to collect over the past couple of months, indicating the exact tactics that that Russia was going to be using in its invasion of Ukraine, reports that have proven to be dramatically accurate. At the same time, in Germany, the Social Democratic government, it's only been in office for about 3 months, in spite of expectations that it would argue for a more accommodating approach to Russia, in fact, has been very quick off the mark to see this invasion as a major threat to its and Europe's broader security, and very swiftly announced the suspension of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was just about to open. For the first time in the post-war history, agreed to push weapons into an active war zone to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, and to substantially increase the German defense budget. We've seen all of the major European financial partners agree with us to substantially increase the costs to the Russian government for this invasion, most notably by putting unprecedented sanctions on the Russian central bank, which will prevent the Russian central bank from accessing its $630 billion in foreign reserves to help keep the Russian economy intact and to keep up the value of the ruble. The imposition of banking sanctions on the SWIFT program also makes it very difficult for Russia's leading banks to conduct business. So the combined effect of all of this, we can already see it, is a massive drop in the value of the ruble. That in turn will lead to massive inflationary spikes and shortages, and will likely increase quite a bit of domestic political discontent within Russia. Other changes that we've seen just today: the foreign minister of Germany, Foreign Minister Baerbock, who comes from the Green Party, very pro-environmental party, announced today that her party would rather support burning coal than buying gas from Russia. No one ever would have predicted any Green Party leadership saying something like that. Other parts of the Western response have been to increase military support. Arms are still going into the Ukrainian army. They're getting them and using them. The United States, just in the past year alone, has contributed more than $1 billion of military assistance. That's likely to continue as long as we can continue getting that material into Ukraine, to the Ukrainian army. We're also going to be working with the Europeans to track down the yachts and other assets of Russian oligarchs around the world. The Justice Department and its European counterparts have already launched a task force to track down and seize these assets. We're also rushing humanitarian assistance to the border. Here, Poland has done a particularly amazing job in accepting everyone from across the border that it shares with Ukraine. They've now have received almost 600,000 of the million refugees that have come in. They're admitting them all without passports. There's a strong tradition of Polish non-governmental humanitarian organizations who have rushed to the scene. Even a friend of mine from my time in Poland wrote to me as he was getting in his car to drive from Warsaw to the Polish border with Ukraine to basically offer shelter in his spare guest room for any Ukrainian family that needs it. And it's really indicative of how concerned the Poles are that they're reaching out to help their Ukrainian neighbors in all of this. So it's a lot that we've done in response with our allies. It's been to an unprecedented degree of unity. But one thing that we've made clear, and President Biden said this the other night in the State of the Union, is that we are not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. We will do everything we can short of that to help the Ukrainians defend their independence and to keep the Russians out, but we're not going to go to a shooting war over it. There have been a number of voices within the United States saying that we should reconsider that. For example, there were calls for the US Air Force to bomb this 40-mile long convoy outside of Kiev, Russian convoy out of Kiev. The United States is not going to do that. There have been calls from some to introduce a no-fly zone in which the US or NATO air forces would shoot down any Russian planes that fly in Ukrainian airspace. That's been ruled out as well. Excuse me. The Russian response to all of this so far has been interesting. I mentioned earlier last week the announcement of Putin that he was putting his nuclear forces on high alert. I don't think that means we're about to get into a nuclear war. I think it was a tactical move on Putin's part to get people in Europe worried about where this was heading and to split up the unity that emerged so quickly in the West. And so far, he's not succeeded in that. But there's also a domestic dimension to his announcement of the nuclear alert. And that is to convey to the Russian people how serious he is about this, how vital a national interest he thinks control of Ukraine is to Russia, and to underscore to them that if they're criticizing his government, that there's going to be hell to pay for that. I think the US and the other NATO nuclear powers were very wise in not responding to that very provocative move. We have not raised our nuclear alert levels, and I think that's the right thing to do. The domestic Russian reaction on the streets, all of you have seen really surprising levels of protest. 7,000 or 8,000 Russians have now been arrested, including grandmothers who police are hustling away for daring to express opposition to the war. And today, the Russian government announced that anyone who says anything critical of the war or describes the war as anything other than what Putin says it is, a limited military operation, will face up to 15 years in prison, which is a pretty unprecedented crackdown on already tightly controlled free speech in Russia. So it's a sign how nervous Putin is about what the domestic reaction, and of course, as the economic situation continues to deteriorate, that domestic reaction is probably going to get even worse. So what's next? I think Russians were hoping for a quick win in all of this. They've not gotten a quick win. I think they've been greatly surprised by the severity and the skill of Ukrainian resistance so far. And we already see in the last couple of days that the Russians are dramatically increasing the scope of their military operations. They've now sent in, by some reports, more than 150,000 troops from the border into Ukraine to accelerate efforts. It's also clear that they are starting to use more bombs in civilian areas, which will contribute to rising civilian casualties. I'm sure they're hoping to put more pressure on the government. They're using these techniques that they've been using in the Syrian civil war for the past several years. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next couple of days we start seeing greater use of the Russian Air Force in supporting this operation, which of course will result in even more casualties. With all of this, and given the huge disparity between the Russian and Ukrainian militaries, I think it's hard to predict anything but a short-term Russian military victory. But there are serious doubts about their ability to sustain that victory. I expect that there's going to be a long-running insurgency of Ukrainian resistance with as much support as the West is able to get to those who are in the resistance. There could be a very messy diplomatic solution. I think that's probably less likely, although it's interesting that the Russians did agree yesterday to a limited ceasefire in some areas to allow supply of humanitarian goods to places that are under attack. Anytime fighting stops in a war, that's a good thing. It's an open window to build on a greater and a more comprehensive ceasefire. I also thought it was very interesting yesterday that Putin called French President Macron, not the other way around. So why would Putin be calling Macron when he says that the war is going very well? And to me, it's a sign that Putin has started thinking about what kind of off-ramps he might be able to pursue. Interestingly, it was the French back in 2008 who negotiated the ceasefire between the Russians and Georgians. So that definitely bears watching as these other pressures mount on Russia in the coming days. We also could be on the threshold of a major political backlash against Putin within Russia because of the collapsing economy, the mounting Russian casualties, the growing likely bloody insurgency that will happen. And so that is certainly, I doubt that that's going to happen, but certainly bears watching in the weeks and months ahead. Regardless of what happens in any of this, it's clear the United States and our military allies have some major decisions to make on the future of European security. I think it's pretty confident that America will emerge still as the leader of the West, and Europe, I think our European allies are looking to the United States to take the lead on this. And we'll have a lot of difficult questions to answer. What are the foreign policy implications? Should we go back to the days of the Cold War and trying to contain Russia from any more attacks or aggression on its neighbors? That's probably a likely outcome. We also will almost certainly continue the deployment of American and other NATO troops to the front lines of NATO's eastern frontier there with Belarus and Russia and Ukraine, certainly to strengthen the position of the Baltic states. As far as the impact of all of this closer to home here, we have 7 Ukrainian students here as students at UVA and at least 1 at WISE. As you might imagine, they are very stressed, very upset about their homelands, about their families, about their friends, about their loved ones. They've gotten some relief from the US government. Last night, the Department of Homeland Security announced that no Ukrainian who is out of immigration status will be deported from the United States for at least the 18 months. So that's next 18 months. So that's allowed some measure of relief. We also have 41 Russian students here. And at President Ryan's request, and I strongly support this, it's very unlikely that any of these students support what their government is doing back in Ukraine. And so we've written to assure them that we're not looking to bully or intimidate or harass them during this time that's very difficult for them as well. So I will be happy to wrap up there. I want to be sure to leave time for your questions. So thanks very much. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions as well.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Steve, for the history and the knowledge. And I want to start with a question that came in a little bit about the Russian people. And is there any chance that the Russian folks will work to overturn, or what's happening in Russia with the people against Putin?
Well, I think the vast majority of the Russian populace only gets their news from Russian government sources. So the vast majority of people, many of them believe that there's not really a war going on in Ukraine, that it's a very limited police action. But however, they already are feeling the bite of these sanctions with shortages, with rising prices, and lots of other economic deprivations. So that will start to indicate to them that something's not right, and it will increase through any major uprising in Russian history. It's always been driven by declining economic conditions for the masses who live in Russia. As far as elites are concerned, Putin has done a very good job at locking their loyalty into him. But they have, unlike China, they have actually fairly open access to the internet. They undoubtedly are aware of what's going on. And there are signs that there's already brewing discontent among some members in the elite against Putin. So the answer, sorry to dodge it, is we don't know. Certainly all of the ingredients are shaping up to put massive pressure onto Putin, maybe even provoking the elite that depend on him to pushing him out and choosing someone else to lead them. What the question is will Putin be alert to this? He's been in absolute power for almost 22 years now. So it's he may not be aware of this brewing, which puts him in some jeopardy. But presumably he'll be aware of some of this rising pressure, and I think that will contribute to his beginning to look for some of these off ramps. But we don't know. It's a huge question to keep a very close eye on for the next 6 months to a year.
Excellent. Following up on that with the sanctions. So you talked in your opening remarks about some of the sanctions, the economic impact of those. In your experience, there are several questions that came in. Do sanctions work? And do we have a historical experience of these working to really affect change? And what impact do sanctions have?
Well, the challenge with sanctions is they undoubtedly work. They don't always work as you expect them to. For example, there can be blowback of the sanctions that we impose. If we put a sanction on to block the sale of Russian oil to the United States, as there's actually growing bipartisan support in the Congress for that move, that will contribute to higher gasoline prices at the pump. There's no doubt about that. It will also have spillover effects on the Russia-Chinese relationship. China, at the beginning of this crisis, pledged unlimited friendship for Russia, but it's been very clear they're getting increasingly nervous about what that will mean. The Chinese have now started to instruct some of their banks that they may not finance trade with Russia because they're worried about getting caught in the web of sanctions that's growing, given their very integrated economy with the rest of the world. The Russian GDP is about $2 or $3 trillion. It's smaller than Italy. China has many more economically important relationships with the countries in the West, and so the impact of sanctions might start to drive China away from Russia and isolate Russia, which could be a good impact for all of this. And then it's undoubted that if there is rising inflation, food shortages in Russia, we're hurting people in Russia who had nothing to do with this invasion and causing a major humanitarian crisis that we will probably have some responsibility for addressing in some way to make sure that the innocent people aren't becoming victims of this sanction policy.
Excellent, thank you. Thinking about the refugee, you talked about 1 million, possibly 10 million down the road, and the countries that are really helping that out. Here in America, how can we help with those humanitarian efforts, and what is the impact? Do you have suggestions for us as we think about the long-term effect for these innocent folks who are fleeing their country?
So great question. And the way this works is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is principally responsible for running refugee operations around the world. They already have staff on the ground. They're overwhelmed right now, as you might imagine, in Romania, Poland, and Hungary, the principal front lines. And they are working with a number of local as well as international non-governmental organizations to amass support to care for these people, to help them get welfare and food and housing and warmth during the winter. If people want to, the way it will work is the first job is get these people away from the border, get them housing and get them fed somewhere. In Poland, they're actually already, before the war started, there were between 1 and 2 million Ukrainians living in Poland. They're actually very happy in Poland, very comfortable there. They have jobs. They're an important part of the Polish economy. So I suspect a lot of people fleeing to Poland will already have family that they can stay with, that will help. But ultimately, as the UN High Commission for Refugees, documents who all of these refugees are, gets what their names are, where they can go, where they might have family. At that point, the UN will then start asking countries like the United States and others to take in refugees, which I'm sure the United States will respond to. Here in Charlottesville, we have a rich tradition of accepting refugees from conflict zones, and I'm sure we would here with fleeing Ukrainians as well. I think there'd be a lot of support for that. For immediately helping, I think the best thing to do is contact, if you're interested in making a contribution, there are a number of highly respected NGOs who are very active, who are already in Ukraine providing relief. That includes, I'm not endorsing any of these, but I can tell you they're well respected. There's a place called Direct Relief. You can go to their website, it's called Direct Relief. Another is the International Medical Corps, which provides a lot of first aid and medicine and medical assistance to victims. Mercy Corps is another very reputable organization that's very, very active in Ukraine and the frontline states right now. Save the Children Foundation and UNICEF, all of these organizations are very active, making a huge contribution to taking care of the people there.
Great, thank you for that. It's really important that we have that strong information and where we can support. You talked a little bit about the history of takeovers. In your opinion, what is the likelihood of this being only the next in a long line of takeovers or invasions by Russia? And how prepared are neighboring states to defend against the type of action that's happening right now in Ukraine?
Well, I think the swiftness of Europe and the United States response, exacting heavy penalties on Russia in the past week, have already done a remarkable job in communicating to countries, whether it's China or Serbia or other countries who might be considering attacks. Certainly, the Russian elite will think twice before taking this invasion farther, because everything that Putin says he didn't want is in fact happening. The number of NATO troops are now increasing on Russia's border. They weren't before he invaded Ukraine. Finland and Sweden, after decades of proclaimed neutrality, the Finnish president is in Washington today, I understand, exploring whether the United States would be supportive of Finland joining NATO, and there's similar conversations underway in Sweden. So NATO would get even bigger. Again, that's not what Russia wanted. So I hope that Putin and those around him are still thinking rationally and can see the results of this kind of aggression is in fact harmful to their interests. So, but it's an open question. As I said earlier, if you're in power for 22 years, you begin to lose a certain touch with reality, and you get a very distorted view. Let's hope there are enough people around Putin to link him back to the reality of the impact of this kind of aggression.
Great, thanks. You mentioned in your main talk about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and there's a question that has come in. Why didn't, number one, can you tell our audience a little bit more about that? And the question is, why didn't Putin wait until that was live? And what impact is that pipeline on this whole attack and this invasion?
So the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a pipeline that goes under the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany, bypassing all of the countries of Central Europe. And Central Europeans like Poland, Romania, certainly Ukraine, the Baltic states were very opposed to the construction of that pipeline because they believed it would link Germany more closely around them to Russia. They would not be able to collect transit fees for allowing gas to go through their territory in Central Europe, and that they would then be basically encircled by an energy network that excluded them, putting them at much greater risk to Russian control. And Germany disregarded those arguments. They thought it was in their economic interest to have as many supplies of gas coming into them as possible. The question about why Russia didn't wait is an excellent question. I don't know the answer to it. I suspect the part of the answer lies in arrogance, because the Germans were so resistant to lots of pressure from the Central Europeans, from the United States, to stopping that pipeline, and the coming to power of the Social Democrats. I think the Russians didn't believe that the Germans would ever cut it off. They thought that that pipeline is such a vital national interest for Germany that they would never dream of shutting it off. So I think Putin was pretty shocked and surprised by that development.
Thank you for that. You talked and gave us a good background of the nuclear weapon threat that you saw or you think. Here's a question from Paul. Did the U.S. incur any obligations to Ukraine as a result of Ukraine's agreement to eliminate its nuclear weapons arsenal?
That's another excellent question, and there frankly is some disagreement about that. Some, especially people in Ukraine, believe that by signing that memorandum in Budapest in 1994, that Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom undertook a guarantee to enforce that if any one of the parties decided to violate the commitment by violating Ukraine's border, as Russia has now done, that there was an implied obligation for the other parties to intervene against the country, in this case Russia, that violated the borders. That commitment was not spelled out in the memorandum. It was a memorandum, not a treaty, and the memorandum had no enforcement mechanism to it at the time. I'm sure there are a lot of people in Ukraine who wish that they had driven a harder bargain. I doubt very much, even now, there's significant opposition to entering into a formal security guarantee for Ukraine. There was certainly strong political opposition in the United States in the 1990s to taking on the promise of defending Ukraine's borders. So I know, having worked in the Clinton administration at the time, it was not the intent of the U.S. government to offer a guarantee of Ukraine's borders. What we did is that we ourselves would respect and support their claim to sovereignty and to their borders, but we did not, rightly or wrongly, did not make commitments to enforce that.
Great, thank you. I really appreciated at the end of your remarks, you talking about our current students from Russia and Ukraine, and in your role as Vice Provost for Global Affairs, as we close out this session with our alumni, parents, and friends, I would love for you just to share with our audience a little bit about your office and how you support all of our international students and some of the resources, some of the innovation strategy that you have on an ongoing basis here at the University of Virginia. That's our students, we all have in common and want the well-being of them at top of heart.
Thanks for that question, Cindy. We have about 3,000 international students here at UVA. They're such a vital, important part of our community. You know, one of our aspirations is to become a global university where people can learn to think globally, have global experiences, even here in Charlottesville. And having a rich and diverse international student community is such an important part of that mission. So of our 3,000 students, and they're undergraduates, graduate, and professional school students, it's been a tough time for them, as you might imagine, during the pandemic. They, at one point, were facing deportation from the previous administration. They were facing some of our Asian students, unfortunately, were targeted by some anti-Asian remarks and harassment out on the street. And they haven't been able to go home to see their parents and their family because of the travel restrictions and quarantine. So President Ryan and Provost McGill and all the deans have been really phenomenal in helping these students to feel at home. We met with them in town halls regularly throughout the pandemic, regularly communicated and tried to address their concern, help them get back home when they needed it, help them get back to the United States when they needed help with their visas. And I'm pleased to say I think we're rebounding. We just made decisions to admit early action applicants, and 6% of our early admission applicants are from international destinations from more than 100 countries. So I think, like the rest of the university, for Americans as well, we're rebounding after the pandemic, and we're so grateful to our broader UVA community among our friends and alumni for helping to make that possible.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve, to you and your office and everyone at UVA who provides that home away from home, that care and concern for all of our students, especially our international students at this time. And I'm sorry that we are out of time, but I am so thankful to you and to be able to host such a meaningful presentation for us to learn more about the issues, to be together in community. I think you and I have chatted about in times of crisis when there's so much uncertainty, the best that we can do is to become educated, to talk to one another, to support each other. And Steve, I thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And for everyone who joined us online, thank you for committing to this lifelong journey with us and for participating in today's webinar. We will have this as a recording to revisit. There was so much information to unpack. I have learned so much, Steve, that I'm going to have to go back to the recording and hit pause every once in a while to fully understand. I felt like I was back in the classroom. But thanks so much for your care, compassion, and your intellect. We are so thankful, and be well, everyone. Have a great day.